In this video we're going to discuss what happens when we raise I to a power. So we've defined I to be the square root of -1. And we've also discussed that then if you square each side of that, you're squaring a square root, so those are going to undo each other. And so I squared is equal to -1. But what happens if we take other powers of I? So let's say we want to cube I. Well, I cubed is the same as I squared times I. Since I squared times I to the first, 2 plus 1 is 3. So we've got 3 factors of I on both sides there. So I squared is -1, so that means we have -1 times I, which we could write as -I. Okay, how about I to the 4th? Well, I to the 4th is I squared times I squared, because 2 plus 2 is 4, and I squared is -1, so that means we have -1 times -1, which is +1. Okay, let's keep going. I to the 5th. Well, that would be I to the 4th times I. And we just said I to the 4th is 1. So we have 1 times I, which is just I. So I to the 5th is equal to I. That's interesting. Let's keep going and see what happens here. I to the 6th. There's different ways you could break these up. You could break up this as I to the 4th times I squared. I to the 4th is 1. I squared is -1. So I to the 6th is equal to -1 also. I to the 7th, well, we could think of that as I to the 6th times I. And we just saw I to the 6th is -1. So we have -1 times I, so -I again. Now let's do one more, I to the 8th. Be I to the 4th times I to the 4th, which is 1 times 1, so 1. So we're seeing a pattern here. I, -1, -I, +1, I, -1, -I, +1. So that pattern keeps repeating. If you raise I to any power, it will be equal to one of those 4 numbers every single time. So let's talk about then, what if we have I to a really big power? How do we figure out which of those 4 things it's equal to then? So for example, what if we have I to the 56th or something? So we're going to talk about even powers first, and then we're going to talk about odd powers. So for even powers, you can rewrite it either as I to the 4th raised to some power, or you can write as I squared raised to some power. You can always rewrite it as I squared to a power, because if the exponent is even, you can divide it by 2, but some of the numbers you won't be able to rewrite as I to the 4th raised to a power if 4 doesn't go into the exponent. So, for example, for I to the 56th, you could write this as I squared to a power because 2 goes into 56. However, 4 also goes into 56. So 56 is 4 times 14. So if you have an exponent already and then you raise that number to another power, that's the same as multiplying the exponents. So that's why we can write it this way, since 4 times 14 is 56. And then I to the 4th is 1. So we have 1 to the 14th, which is just 1. Okay, like I said, you also could have rewritten it as I squared to a power. So 56 is 2 times 28. And then I squared is -1. However, if you raise a negative number to an even power, it is going to come out positive. Because if you pair up those negative ones, they'll all pair up. So you'll have a bunch of positive ones. So in this case, you can do it either way. Now sometimes 4 doesn't go into your exponent. For example, if you have I to the 38. 4 doesn't go into 38, so we can't use I to the 4th, but we can write it as I squared. And 38 is 2 times 19. So we have -1 to the 19th. Now if you raise a negative number to an odd power, you start pairing up all those negative ones, you're going to have an odd one left. So -1 to an odd power is going to be -1. So that's how we deal with I to an even exponent. You write it either as I squared to a power or I to the 4th raised to a power. Now what if we have an odd exponent? So if you have an odd exponent on your I, what you're going to do is factor out an I. And then you're going to do the same thing we just did, because the remaining part will have an even exponent. Typo here. Factor out I. And the remaining part has an even exponent. So, for example, if we have I to the 13th, so when I say factor, the word factor means write it as a product. So we're going to write this as I times something. So this would be I times I to the 12th. And now I to the 12th has an even exponent, so we can deal with that just like we did before. So since 4 goes into 12, we can think of this as I to the 4th cubed. And then I to the 4th is 1. So if I times 1 cubed is 1, so just have I. Okay, so we have I to the 27th. So we're going to pull one of those factors of I out, which leaves us with 26. And then that's an even exponent. So I to the 26th we could write as I squared to the 13th, since 2 times 13 is 26. So I times, I squared is -1, and -1 to the 13th. -1 to an odd exponent is going to be -1. So we have I times -1, which is -I.